So.
All right.
All right. I am grateful to keep going on the conversation with what's going on in our particular time period with the issues of racism that have raised themselves back up through the things with, well, the list gets longer. Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and then others that we've seen in the last few months. And I am glad to have an opportunity to be in conversation with some pastors that are in my area in Baldwin County, Alabama, which is just across the bay from Mobile, Alabama. And so I am really thankful to have Pastor Charles Jackson, who's pastor of Macedonia Baptist Church in Daphne, Father Taylor Ishii, who works with youth at the church I get to go to, Church of the Apostles in Montrose, which is this unique area between Daphne and Fairhope, Alabama, and then Rich Mueller, who pastors Holy Trinity Lutheran Church in Daphne. And we all work together in a group called Path to Peace, which is bringing white churches and black churches together to talk about how do we eradicate racism of the heart. But I wanted to keep the conversation going with the context of where we are in our particular time. So Pastor Jackson, if I could just start with you. A couple of times we've had conversations in the last few weeks. You have said specifically, it feels like we're in the 1960s all over again. And we had a prayer vigil for George Floyd and all of these issues, and you brought that up in discussing that with your daughter. And could you just talk about what are you seeing and what are you thinking about when you say things like that?
Thank you very much, Dan, for having me and for being on and for us being able to sit down and have this dialogue. I think it's needed. It's pertaining to the question that you're asking, the statement that I made at the prayer vigil. I was born 1965. Actually, on Saturday, I'll be 55 years old.
All right.
So as a youth, thank you. As a youth, I kind of miss those times. So what I'm seeing on television, I was like 3 or 4, 5 years old. And I heard the stories from. Yeah, so I heard the stories from my mom, from my parents, from my family members, and when you go back and watch it, via the videos, you would think you're living in 2020 or 2019, or you start backing the train back up to I think 1995 when they beat Rodney King.
Right. Yeah.
It's like when is it going to change? When is it going to get better? When is it going to be where we actually see one another as brothers and sisters, regardless of the color of your skin or the texture of your hair? So it's very challenging. And I have my wife and I, we have 4 children total, 3 boys, 2 of them were raised in my home. And then we have our 18-year-old daughter. And personally, I've been very blessed as far as having to deal with it, racism directly. And once again, let me emphasize, I come out of a single family household in Pritchett. So I was very careful early on and just picked up early on how to handle myself when I'm around the police, or if I go into a store, go in knowing that they're looking at you and very, very close to you, and don't put your hands in your pocket. And so I've actually had 2 conversations with the 2 oldest boys. One of them was living in Daphne at the time. And police pulled him over, and the first question, nothing was wrong. He just pulled him over. First question that he asked was, "Do you have any drugs?" And I'm just like, what do you mean? And he said, "Dad, I was just driving and he pulled me over First question he asked is, do I have any drugs on me?
Wow.
And I was like, wow. So at the time, I knew someone on the force that's a member of the church, and I immediately called him and say, hey, what's going on there? Why would he pull him over and ask that kind of question? He said they're in narcotics, and the first thing that they want to do is see if they get nervous when they ask him that question.
Wow.
And I was like,
if you're nervous already,
if I'm pulled over, and even if I, don't have any drugs, I'm gonna, what are you talking about?
You're gonna be nervous to begin
with.
with.
You're gonna be nervous.
Right.
So you can initiate that by that question.
Just by the question.
By the question.
Yeah.
So that was one incident, and then another one was one of my other son. Our other son was coming home from Tuskegee at the time. The car broke down, I think around Greenville. I'm on the phone with him. He calls the police because the car broke down. He called them. Police gets there. He starts walking toward the police. I say, what? I said, is the police there? He said, yes. He said, I said, well, what are you doing? He said, I said, oh, no, stop right now. Don't go any further. And as I'm telling him that, he said, the police is telling him right behind me. He said, my dad just told me that. I said, yeah, I just told you that if you want to live, you need to stop. Even though you called them, you do exactly what they tell you to do. So I was thankful that both of them, and even with me personally, I live in Saraland, and it's been several years, probably about 6 years ago, one of the headlights were out. And the police officer pulled me over. And I'm being very careful with every move that I make. I live here. I live in this city.
Right.
But I'm saying, is it okay if I reach and get my insurance and whatever else you need? He said, and thankfully he said, yeah, I don't need that. I'm just letting you know your headlights out. But I mean, it could have gone a totally different way.
Yeah.
Right.
I think what we have to do is, and I'm very thankful for you, brother, as being on here and you starting it, the conversation, is that we, as a believers in Jesus Christ, once you say that, then you're my brother and you're my sister.
Amen.
Regardless of where you're from, regardless of your background, your education, income, where you live, then you're my brother and sister. I think that supersedes anything else. And, so when we look at it, it's just so much going on. And then here we are. I actually had to have the talk with my daughter.
Tell me about that talk. When you talk about the talk, what's that talk?
The talk is, especially before it was just the boys.
Right.
If you're pulled over, don't make any sudden moves. Don't get out the car. Keep your hands where they could see them. Follow the instructions that they give you to a T. Don't argue. Even if you haven't done anything, do not argue. Just do exactly what they say. If they want you to get out, they want to frisk you, let them do it. Because if not, and that's just the police officers, even going into stores, you got to be careful there, because that can escalate. I saw you trying to put your hands in your pocket. Right. I saw you had a pair of pants. Now they're gone. So now they're going to call security. Security wants to call the police department. So it just keeps spiraling and getting bigger and bigger over something simple.
Yeah.
And I think a lot is, I think we have actually, I know we have a meeting scheduled July the 7th with Daphne Police Department.
Okay.
And one of the things that I want to ask the chief is, as far as diversity training, if a police officer pulls a Caucasian over versus an African American, I think we talked about it before, our gestures are different. Our language is different. We look different. If I say, hey, what's going on? Is that going to make you nervous? Now you feel like I'm disrespecting you.
Right.
Man.
So, and if there's no diversity training, what you may see as a threat is my everyday language and body motion.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
So,
and both of those things that you talked about with what you need to talk to your kids about are things that I would just never think about needing to talk about with I raised 3 boys as well, and just never needing to have those specific conversations. But it's interesting that those 2 things that you have talked about were the 2 things that it was in George Floyd's situation.
Yeah.
Was what was happening when he was in a store, and then the police interacting after that. Both of those were in his situation.
Right.
And that ended badly.
Very badly. Yeah.
So yeah, it's those kinds of things that we need to be more aware of, that there are these conversations that have to be had because of who you are, that they just don't happen to me. And those are things we need to be aware of. Taylor, I'm also appreciative because of just the things that you've gone through, and we've talked about, you and I, at different times, but in this current climate and with this time of pandemic and coronavirus and these issues with George Floyd and all of these other things that are being raised up, how has racism touched you or others in the Asian community, and what have been ongoing issues that sometimes we're just not aware of?
Yeah, I mean, I think the news has covered it to some degree, but I think not with the amount that is maybe been appropriate for the amount of incidents that are going around. I mean, I think, I don't think anyone would be surprised to hear that either violence or verbal physical harassment against Asians and Asian Americans has been on the rise, specifically since, the pandemic has started to take a hold of our country, mid-late March, something around that time frame. But I think people would be surprised at the frequency of it. The last number that I had seen from a site that was self-reported data from the Asian American community was early June, and it was close to 2,000 cases had been reported across the country.
Wow. Since mid-March?
Yeah, since mid-March.
Wow.
And that's self-reported. That's people who know that there's a site that they can report this on. And this was a whole project that had been done by an Asian American professor who was curious about this and wanted to know, and said, we need to raise the profile of this. Just even anecdotally, there's another priest who's Asian. He's not Asian American because he's Canadian. Asian Canadian, I suppose.
Canadians are Americans.
I think there are times they might want to claim that, but more often than not, they don't.
Not these days. Yeah.
Yeah, and he and I were talking. We've been just connected through a variety of different things through our denomination and stuff, and he was telling me that they have a senior priest, I believe he's a bishop actually, up in his area, which is Vancouver, so British Columbia, but there's a large Asian population there. It's one of the big places where Asian immigration is happening in North America and specifically Canada. And he was saying that someone in Costco came up and kicked this guy. Kicked him. And he's like 60.
In Canada?
Yeah, in Canada, right?
Like they're nice in Canada.
Nice and Asian. Yeah, so, and that was, it's stuff like that where it's like, what is going through someone's mind where they would see someone in the store and like come up and kick them?
Right.
Like, it's just like, it's so beyond my like just way of processing the world.
Comprehension. Yeah.
Yeah. That, but there's this like, I think there's underneath all of that, right, is there's this innate fear of otherness or difference.
Something different.
Right. Right. That can turn into violence.
Yeah.
If it's not checked or we're not aware of that. And I think some of that is just self-awareness.
Yeah.
But, it hasn't been helped by the way that coronavirus has been talked about, especially early on.
Right.
Calling it Chinese virus or some of the other names that have been thrown out, things like Kung Flu and stuff like that.
Right.
And that actually maps onto just a history of othering of Asians in our country. If you could look back in the history books, the very first piece of legislature that actually made immigration from another country illegal was the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. That was the first piece of actual legislature from our government that was there to stop Chinese immigrants from coming into the country.
Wow.
So, it's not as if there have been only issues that have been black and white, revolving around racism or xenophobia or things like that. I mean, Dan, I think you and I have talked about this a little bit, and I've shared this in some other contexts, but part of my Asian ethnicity heritage is Japanese American, and my grandmother was interned during World War II.
Wow.
She was locked up for about 2.5 years. She was a senior in high school, and she wasn't able to walk at her graduation because she got sent to camp.
Wow. Man.
And so that's been part of my family's history, and it, quite frankly, it was something my grandma just didn't really want to talk about.
Yeah. There. Outside of that, what are some other things that we're just not of the, like this particular time period with coronavirus? What are other issues that have just been? I know one of the things that we've mentioned a couple of times with each other, and then in other conversations, is this issue of model immigrant.
Model minority, yeah.
Model minority, yeah.
Yeah.
What's that?
Yeah, so the model minority is this false premise that that Asian Americans are the model minority, that Asian Americans are basically, like, if you want to put it in really crass language, they are the way that anyone who is coming into this country should act in terms of assimilation, in terms of, again, this is all false.
Yeah, right.
But the perception is, like, in terms of assimilation, in terms of work ethic, in terms of, upward mobility within society, in terms of contributions, right? You think of classic, types of career choices that Asian Americans are found in, right? It's a lot of tech stuff, engineering, doctors, lawyers, all that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But the history of that's really messy because, again, this is kind of like an ideology that was actually in some ways used against the Black community by the white community. It was kind of put up in opposition to say that, look at how this group of people who are different than the white community have adapted to America. And the implicit understanding was, why can't the Black community or the Hispanic community do the same thing?
Wow.
And that also gets further complicated by the fact that if you also look at throughout history too, early on, only the best of the best were allowed back into the country. So you had, based on some of the immigration quotas and stuff, you had all these professionals coming in from Asia. But if you look at more recent waves of Asian immigrants, you've got like a lot of Vietnamese who came over after the instability in their region as a result of the Vietnam War. And many of those were not what this model minority thing might suggest. A lot of them were poor. They had very little money, if any money at all, when they were coming to the country. They were looking to be a part of this American dream and find a better way of life. And so it's kind of this like, it's a stereotype that's used that isn't even true of the whole of the Asian community as a whole. because there are sections of different Asian ethnicities that have really high rates of poverty in the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
So it's this idea that I think, and again, it sets up the standard of assimilation that I think is kind of problematic, right?
Right.
It makes it so that the best way to exist within our country is to just kind of just put your head down and work really hard and not say anything.
Right.
Right. And that's something that I've even personally wrestled with in my life. I mean, growing up, I wanted to do all of those things, and you've got some other layers in there of, respect and following authority are really high values in a lot of Asian culture.
Yes.
So, you kind of have that, and it creates the sense of guilt and shame, and like, we should just be quiet and follow direction.
Mm-hmm.
And that is even, and part of that is I even personally had to wrestle with this whole idea when I was in college of, why did God give me an Asian heritage? Is that a good thing? Is that even like a gift that I can look into? And do I not have to just think about myself as trying to just go along with the flow, or can I be proud of who I am? Can I see that as a gift that God has given me? Do I not be steep?
Can you be who you are?
Right. And not only that, but like, how can God actually use the culture that I came from for ministry? And kind of wrestling with that for the past, 10, 12 years since has gotten me to the place where I think I'm able to talk about this stuff and to feel like, I can have a voice in this conversation, and just the understanding that like God made the diversity of nations and cultures in our world, and God delights in that diversity. That's a
right.
All of that stuff is gonna stay with us in heaven, right? It talks about how all peoples and nations and tribes and tongues and all of that, right, are going to be together in God.
Yeah.
So some of these, even, physical differences in our skin color and stuff like that, I mean, I read that as saying that God's going to keep it that way. And that God doesn't want this monolithic understanding of what it means to be a human, but the diversity he's created within us is a good thing, and that we can celebrate that. And for me in particular, part of that was not being ashamed of that.
Yeah.
I concur with you, and I think that's the beauty.
Right.
That's the beauty, that we're different.
Right.
And God created us. That I think that was a part of his plan.
Right.
And now we can come together as one.
Yeah.
It's almost like a big puzzle. And you're putting all the pieces to the puzzle. None of the pieces to the puzzle are the same. They're all different. But the beauty of it is when it's finished.
Yeah.
Right. And the most important thing that we have in common is Jesus, right?
That's the unity.
That's the unity.
That's the unity. And we want the whiteness to be the unity. It's Christ who's the unity.
Exactly.
It actually starts at creation in the image of God.
Yes.
We are Charles, you bear the image of God.
Yes.
Taylor, you bear the image of God. Dan, you bear the image of God.
Yep.
Even on my worst days, I bear the image of God. So I mean, and bring in God's Son, and it's a slam dunk.
Yeah. Exactly. So, Rich, let me ask you, because you and I had talked just briefly about this, but I had lived and pastored in Minneapolis for 20 years, where the latest episode with George Floyd has happened. You were in New York, is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. And so both of us have an experience of being in northern places where we know racism kind of crops up in these areas where you go, wait a minute, we're progressive, we're good Northern European Scandinavians, and this shouldn't happen. So what happened to the good old Northern European living, and all of a sudden it turns up racist? What's going on here?
Well, I'm going to start with a little bit of myth busting. First of all, Scandinavian heritage and culture is divided between the Danes, the Norwegians, the Swedes, and the Finns.
Yeah, sure, you betcha.
They don't get along so well. And I'll give you a prime example. On any given street corner in Minnesota, small town, big town, large town, whatever, medium-sized town, you'll find 3, if not 4, Lutheran Scandinavian churches.
Yep.
One of them Swedish, one of them Danish, one of them Norwegian, one of them Finnish. You throw in Northern Germans into that, and the pot is really all stirred up.
Yep.
So I think that hegemony is, as I said, somewhat of a myth.
Right.
And I think there is a drastic change that happens in the when these various groups emigrated to the United States in the mostly in the 1800s and early 1900s. They left behind some pretty dire situations in a lot of cases, but they also took on some of the rugged American individualistic, we're going to do this ourselves, to hell with everybody else, quite frankly, characteristics that come with being a quote-unquote American. So the other thing, I think when Dan brought this question up and I got to thinking about it, spin that forward to the current situation. And I know we try to leave politics out of this, but the current political and situation and environment has made it permissible to be racist.
Yes.
And I think some of those things, it was part of my myth that how could this happen in sweet Minnesota? Come on.
Right.
Or as you said before, how could this happen in sweet Canada? It's kind of mind-boggling, but that itself was a myth. And underneath that facade, if you will, of progressiveness and of accepting and of diversity and of not being threatened by all of that, they were threatened and continue to be. And now it's become very acceptable to express that fear, that frustration, that doubt, and that divisiveness, and that ill feeling towards diversity. Why can't they all be like us? Even if they don't look like us, they can at least be like us, or learn how to be like us or whatever. It gets, as Taylor used this term a couple of times, it's very complex, and it gets very, very, very complex as we move along. And we haven't always done the best job, particularly in these predominantly white Northern European churches of being real open to any kind of change or any kind of encounter with change. There's the old joke of how many Lutherans does it take to change a light bulb? And the response is, change? What do you mean, change? Anyway, I just really, really appreciate the opportunity to be a part of these discussions and to be a part of this Path to Peace movement, and to count as colleagues and friends the likes of Charles and Taylor
That's right.
and all the rest.
Mm-hmm.
Been a real blessing to me. I grew up lily white, but thanks be to God, my heroes growing up were baseball players.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a huge baseball fan.
Yeah.
And my heroes were Bob Gibson,
Mm-hmm.
who's black,
Mm-hmm.
Kirk Flood,
Yep.
who was black,
Mm.
Lou Brock, who was black, Bill White, who was black.
Man, you got all the St. Louis Cardinals there.
1964 Cardinals. That's my team. I can tell you their numbers.
You're singing my song here.
I can tell you their batting averages
and their ERA. Yeah.
But fortunately, and that was such a positive framework or a positive example of what these different looking people were and could be, and how successful and how gracious they were. Even you read Bill White's book called Uppity, about his struggles to just buy a house in St. Louis in 1962 or 3 when he first came up with the Cardinals. You read what's his name? I can't even think of the author's name anymore. It's a book about the Cardinals and Yankees and how they both got to be in the '64 World Series. And there's a portion of that book that deals with Gussie Busch owning the Cardinals, and he asked one of the black players how they were doing at the hotel.
In spring training. It was
spring training,
and
this player had to inform Mr. Busch that he didn't get to stay at the hotel. He had to stay across town in private homes because the hotel wasn't integrated at that point. This is in early 1960s. The next year, Gussie Busch had bought the hotel and then integrated it so that the whole team could stay together. So those are some of my stories from some of that, and
such great men because they were proud black men.
Exactly.
They were fierce in competition, and they were proud of who they were. And Kurt Flood was, goes straight at Mr. Busch saying, "We don't get to stay in that hotel."
Exactly. Yeah.
So.
Yep. And and there were stories about people standing, when after the hotel did integrate and black and white were using the pool together, people standing outside the fence, wondering if the blackness would come off in the chlorine pool. I don't, or whether the water would turn black or what. I don't know what they were looking for, but they were just stunned in amazement that these two different groups could be together in that way and enjoy one another's company. So, Bob Gibson's best friend on the team was left-handed pitcher Ray Sadecki, Polish. And I could just imagine some conversations over dinner between this Polish left-handed pitcher and this this black African-American speedball pitcher. So just amazing stuff. So anyway,
let me ask this of all of you, but I'll just, if we could start with Pastor Jackson. What do you all think has caused this time to be such a moment in our culture? What do you think is going on that all of a sudden there we are, and Ahmaud Arbery really started some conversation, and then George Floyd. But what do you think has caused it? Why is this a moment in our culture? And Pastor Jackson, just start with you and just follow with you other guys.
For me personally, I kind of look at I just did an interview with the Baldwin County Times, I believe she called, and was asking a question about Path to Peace. She kind of presented the same question to me, and I always try to relate what's going on in the country back to the Bible. And because nothing's really new,
Right.
when you look at it.
That's it.
Nope.
So when I told her, I said, well, when the children of Israel went into the bondage in Pharaoh in Egypt, they were there for about 400 years. And you look at African Americans who have been here, I think it's like 401.
Yeah.
401 years.
Right.
So 40 and 400, and test the biblical numbers, testing times, tribulations. And so now you look at the new generations, and even with the wilderness wandering, it was 40 years, because he had to let that generation 21 plus had to die off.
Right.
And so now you're seeing this new generation that's saying, I wasn't, even though mama and daddy and great grandmama and them may have been that way, I'm not that way, because I'm going to school with these. You look at before, the schools were segregated. I'm a University of Alabama graduate, but Vivian Malone and the others made it possible for me to be able to go there.
Right.
But now they're going to school with them. They're in class. They're studying with them. So they're saying, I don't see you. I'm living in the same neighborhood. I now work with you. The most segregated day now is Sunday. So when you look at it, I think it's just the timing of everything. And my wife and I was just having the talk earlier today when I got home, is that now I just hope that it's the true change that's coming to the United States, quote unquote, of America, where everyone's supposed to be treated fairly, equally within the society as well as within the justice system, which has never been. Right. Right. That even, that it's a little bit better now, but it's really, back in the day, it was never that way. How can a all white jury with a white judge,
jury of your peers,
you know that and justice is supposed to be blind. You know the ending of that case before it even begins. You know how that's going to turn out. So when you look at all of that prayerfully now, that this is the turning point with, quote unquote, the millennials that are saying, we don't want this to be anymore. And I think I even referenced in one of our conversations that when my daughter and I we went and were watching Selma several weeks ago. I don't know if you all seen it. Yeah. And when Dr. King says, hey, we being African Americans and Black at the time, we can't do this on our own. It's nothing's going to change. Right. He said we need to call our brothers and our Caucasian brothers and sisters of the clergy if a change is going to take place. And they went to call it, and they all showed up. Not all showed up, but a lot of them showed up. And they marched with them. So that's when it really started to change. And now we're looking at the same thing in 2020. It shouldn't be going on. It's no, I'm not saying I respect the police department as a whole, because when we need them, we call them, they show up. But at the same time, there are some bad officers. Right. That goes back to, I think, Richard, what you talked about, that's just filled with hatred. Filled with bigotry. Filled with, I'm superior, I got this badge, and you're going to do what I tell you to do when I tell you to do it. Right. So many cases could have been handled totally different. You mentioned earlier, Mr. George Floyd, his life is gone over an allegedly $20 fake bill.
A fake bill.
No robbery.
Right.
No gun.
Right.
And the same thing, I'm trying to remember the name of I think this is when Path to Peace started. The one was in New York over selling loose cigarettes.
Yeah, Eric Gardner.
I think that's when we kind of came together, I believe.
Okay.
So you look at that, loose cigarettes, my life is gone. You can't say, hey man, You selling it, once you go on, don't be selling, go on down. So
Right.
and be done with it.
Right. Exactly.
But it goes to the mentality of some of the officers, and not all, that feel I'm superior. We may as well just go ahead. I'm superior. You're going to do what I tell you to do when I tell you to do it. If not, I've got my gun, and I can take you down, and I can put whatever charges I want on you. I can, and very quickly you're resisting arrest now.
Yeah.
So that's where we are, I think, and it's my prayer that you haven't seen the marches anymore. Well, to my knowledge, they're not covering it as much, and that's kind of been the pattern. Everybody's on fire, and then all of a sudden it kind of dwindles out. And so we're prayerfully it won't dwindle out this time.
Right.
Richard, I know you mentioned that we're not supposed to talk about politics, but I think that's another. There's two elephants in the room.
Yeah.
And I think
you can't get around it.
You can't get around it.
Yeah.
You can't, even with the statues. He continues.
Yeah.
To have the prime opportunity to truly bring the country together.
And it doesn't.
And I'm looking at us like, come on, you can do it. You can do it. Come on, you got it's here. Just say, hey, enough is enough. Don't stand up, because even within the interview, the question was asked me, what do I think about them? Do I think them tearing down the statues is hurting the movement? And I say, you really can't say that it's hurting the movement. It may be bringing more attention to the movement, but I can't say that it's slowing it down. I say when one person look at a statue, they look at it as far as, quote unquote, their heritage, their history.
Yeah.
When I look at it, I see oppression, I see slavery.
Right.
Yeah.
And I don't need to be reminded of what my ancestors and forefathers went through, because it's saying that statue represent that we'll still have the power.
Right.
And it's no way in 2020 that we should be arguing over statues.
Right.
Yeah.
There's no way.
Yeah.
And if they're offensive,
it's a diversion. That's for sure.
Yeah, and I think that's one of those things that why I want to keep conversations going, because of diversion. It's too easy for us as whites just to do something like that. I just can't stand the rioting, or I just can't stand them tearing down statues. And now I can offload that and go back. And the other thing is the way the language is beginning to change, which is why I want to keep the conversation going, because it's moved from protesters to rioters.
Yeah.
And when riots were early,
domestic terrorists.
Domestic terrorists, yeah. So the language has shifted to help us as whites feel more comfortable about laying it aside. And as a matter of fact, my kids two of my boys that still live in Minneapolis will tell you, protests are still going on. But you don't hear about them because they're just marching, and they're doing the work they need to do without tearing everything up, But that's not newsworthy, and so it's easy to ignore. And then if you see a protest, you call them riots, and so that language is helping us just to kind of move back, and we've got to keep moving forward. How about Rich or Taylor with just that question? What do you think has caused this to be a moment?
I think the immediacy of these things becoming known, these incidents becoming known, the modern technology, the instant news, we don't have to wait for history books or the evening news.
And it's unfiltered.
It's right there. Yeah, it's right there. And it can't be denied. It can't be glossed over. It's in your face in a good way, in terms of there's no getting around this stuff anymore. You can't sweep it under the carpet. You can't spin it. There's no time to spin it because it's there.
Mm-hmm.
Try as they may, but anyway, that has a lot to do with what has made it more. I don't know if the word is acceptable or more understandable that these protests do exist and take place and start out as reaction to these injustices that are literally undeniably right in front of our faces. We can't hide anymore, and need to be dealt with. The whole situation needs to be dealt with in constructive and as positive ways as possible.
Yeah.
And that takes lots of us coming together to do this kind of work, to do the hard work that it takes to affect appropriate change and to make it better for the generation coming after us. So Dan and I were talking about this a little bit before, but I've pretty much given up on folks my age and older. We've kind of blown it. For want of a better term, and it's younger folks and I'm the oldest one in the house here right now. I know that. I remember those 60s that Charles was talking about and was born into in 1965. I was, I was in my teens then, and I remember the day that Martin Luther King Jr. was shot, and sitting down at the dinner table that night, and my stepfather, who was pretty much a racist, didn't mind. I mean, he loved them same black baseball players I did too, but he didn't mind calling them darkies or whatever. He had his terms for them. But he said, I'll never forget this. He said that night at the head of the table when that news came out. I don't appreciate what this guy is been doing or was doing, or the things he was stirring up, and probably a lot of that was guilt. It was making him, my stepfather, think about things that he needed to think about, but didn't want to think about. He was being confronted by the reality of the world, even in 1965, 67, 68, whatever. But he said they didn't have to shoot him. They didn't have to shoot him. And I went, wow, there's a spark of life in this guy. It's not all, I mean, so anyway. But I remember him saying that very distinctly. They didn't have to shoot him.
Yeah. So. And it really seems, since we have unfiltered things like you watch for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, that officer on his neck. There's a sense of, even ones that I wouldn't have ever had this conversation before, 4 years ago with Philando Castile, where it's like that was wrong, And
Michael Brown was wrong. In Ferguson, that whole thing. And
Ahmaud Arbery.
I lived in Ferguson. It was nothing like that when I lived there, but somehow it's gone downhill and gotten worse in terms of the interaction between the different sides of the community. So anyway,
Taylor, what do you think about how does this get to be this moment?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely technology is a piece of that, right? Like, I mean, I know even for me personally, like I really started digging in and learning and paying attention around Mike Brown. That was around that time when I was starting to trying to understand how things like this can happen. I mean, that was the first time I became aware of what Charles was talking about the talk that Black families had. I had no consciousness of that before that. And, I was in my late 20s at the time, and had grown up in relatively diverse areas and lived in relatively diverse areas, but hadn't heard about that and wasn't aware that that kind of a reality that, Black Americans are dealing with day in and day out. I mean, I've got a daughter who's about to turn 2 in a little bit, and I can't imagine as a father having to sit down with her and having to talk her through something like that. That really blew my mind. But I think also, though, and this is where I think there's hope for our society, and I think hope for the church, is I think it's been a slow cumulative effect, right? All of these things over time have garnered different amounts of people's attention, and people can have different stories or interpretations of all of that. I'm not interested in debating the nature of each and every case. People will undoubtedly see things the way they want to see things. And that's just part of being human, is we have biases. And until we are aware of those biases and are trying to not only be aware of them, but even saying some of these are bad and some of these I need to actively fight against, we could spend 5 minutes naming off all the names of these different injustices and killings or shootings of Black folks in America that have gone viral on social media. So I think, like Rich said, the unfiltered nature of social media. I mean, a lot of people haven't witnessed someone get shot or get killed right in front of their very, very eyes. And that's unsettling, and as it should be. But I think to me, it seems like it's been the cumulative effect of a lot of that. And I think, part of that too, right, is, this idea of using that power of the people in social media to create accountability, right? Like what happens when people pull out their phones and start recording so that there's a record, right? In the event that something might go wrong. And then there's something to say, it's not just my word against their word, right? Now there's some evidence that still has a perspective, right? But it can come into the picture, it can get out into the public sphere. I mean, right, like, social media is a powerful thing that can be used for good and be used for bad. We're seeing a big mix of both of that. I think another piece of this is honestly the pandemic, right? You have a lot of people with their attention not nearly as divided as it normally is.
Right, we weren't as distracted.
And I mean, I love sports. Here I am wearing my baseball hat. I'm also a big baseball fan too. I love soccer. There's a lot of things. And so my attention a lot of times is following up on the news of the teams that I love. But when all of that has been stripped away, I think, people had been going to social media for news and also for interaction with folks. So I think it spread very quickly because of that. I think people weren't able to just distract themselves from the terrible thing they had witnessed or heard about in the ways that we normally do. And I think the big thing that makes me hopeful that there might be a change is I've either attended or been on staff at majority white churches all of my life. And so inevitably my Facebook timeline is pretty white. And I've seen more people say, I'm listening, I want to learn in the aftermath of George Floyd than I ever have of any other incident of an death of a Black.
I think that too.
And I mean, I'm sure, that's not the case for everybody, but that's what makes me hopeful, is to see people who I would have never expected to say, especially on something like social media, I'm listening, or I'm seeing something, I'm seeing perspectives I've never seen before. And I think this will probably lead into another conversation I know you've wanted us to talk about, but I think this is where the church has the opportunity to step up and to lead, right? There are people wanting to learn
Let's
and to know and to
let's go with that. Let's go with that. So what's the opportunity? And Taylor, just keep going with that. What's the opportunity for the church right now?
I think part of the opportunity is to say that this is wrong.
Yeah.
I mean, it feels like that's like
things aren't right.
Yeah.
But
Something's not right about this situation, period.
right. And to say, but not only is this wrong, here's why this is wrong, right? There's got to be this like theological reason underneath of it all. And you know, we've talked about this a little bit, right? This whole idea that God has made all of humanity in his image, that God
all God's children.
Right.
All
God's children, that God loves the diversities of cultures in our world. And also, right, too, you can look into the Bible and you can see that, and you see this played out in particular in the New Testament in a lot of ways, but like, right, like, sure, God chose the nation of Israel, right? But how was the nation of Israel supposed to function? They were blessed by God to bless the whole of humanity, right?
Yes.
Israel got it wrong when they kept that blessing.
Yes. Yep.
Right.
I totally agree with you.
And you see that, you know, pushed into the New Testament, right? When you see the falling of God's Spirit on all people, right? Not just Jews. You see this going out to the nations, to the Gentiles. So it's the, you know, I think that too often in our churches, it's easy to think that God only cares about the people that look like us,
right,
fit into our socioeconomic tier, or, you know, work where we work or play where we play. And, you know, that's just
or worship where we worship,
right?
You know?
And that's just blatantly not true.
Yeah.
And you know, the church needs to be saying that. The church needs to be, you know, just super clear that, you know, that there's injustice in the world, and that God has something to say about injustice, and that God sees the injustice. He hears the pain of those who have been victimized and oppressed and, you know, and been stepped upon, and that those are precisely the people whom Jesus came to die for.
Yeah.
And to save and to welcome into his family and to give them an inheritance that they never thought they had.
Right. Yeah. Rich, what do you think? What's the hope or the opportunity for the church in this moment?
I think the realization that, as I said, something is drastically wrong. And to help people to see that and understand that, I think people are beginning to ask that question. And most times it comes in the form of, we're in the end times, aren't we? This has got to be the end, right? They said that during the Civil War. They said that during, you know, the Crusades. They said that during whatever. Every generation has their quote unquote end times.
Yep.
I think it's the beginning of some hopefully new times and good times of celebrating that diversity and of moving beyond and hopefully again pointing to the folks coming after us, leaving something better and bringing something better along, and realizing a bit of that kingdom of God and drawing near, and that a bit of resurrection and new life here and now in this sphere that God intends for all God's children, no matter the race, no matter the color, no matter the language, no matter, all God's children. So
yeah, Pastor Jackson, what do you see? What's the opportunity here that we can have going forward as the church?
I think it's I must concur with Taylor and Richard. This is the opportunity. This is God. when you look at everything as a whole, I don't think it's by mistake that COVID-19 spread across the country.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think, and I'm not going to, blame China, because ultimately, and I've been having discussions with some other people, I said whether it was out of a lab or out of the market, it originally came from the bat, is what they're saying. And I know who made the bat.
There you go.
And it's God's way of getting the world's attention. He took us all out of our state of just being happy and go lucky, and got our attention. And even with that, we were still selfish, arrogant, and cocky, and not hearing his voice and what was going on, and said, "We surrender. What do you want us to do?" And now, so it's got the church is now out of the norm.
Yep.
Church is where it should have been.
Yep.
Not within the walls.
Yep.
And so we, the church, must take the lead. We can't make the same mistake that the nation of Israel continued to make. We have the book to go back and look and say, okay, when they did this, God blessed them. When they were disobedient, he punished them. They cried out. He punished them for a while. He told the neighbors, okay, that's enough. Release them, let them go. So you look at it as if God is now saying, you all have the responsibility to tell the world and lead the world to worshiping me, and you've just been inside your walls. That's where you've been. You haven't really shared. So now when you look at it as far as the number of people that you're reaching now via, I think, Taylor, you mentioned it earlier, social media can be used for good or it could be used for bad. Now, social media is being used, perhaps from the church's standpoint, for good, to reach people that we wouldn't have been able to reach, that wouldn't have come to church, that they're being now forced to watch it via the internet. And I recently I was talking to my wife and one of my deacons. I recently told them, I said, I've got to change my whole approach now. Because I used to tell them that the streaming is for people that are at home, that can't come to church. You need to be coming to church. You need to be assembling with us. Now the approach is, okay, it's okay to stay at home.
Right. Yeah.
But watch this. Now it may be some that weren't coming but are watching.
Right.
What do we do as far as bringing them in? So now we may have to actually have some virtual members of Macedonia.
Right. That's right.
They may never come in. They may never come in. Yeah. But they're still a part of what we're doing.
Exactly.
And that's such a good point, because what you were saying from the pulpit on Sunday, all of you is what people who don't normally listen now have the opportunity to listen in.
Right. Yeah.
And so what you're saying on Sunday about these issues of justice, are we loud? Are we forward?
Yeah.
So I look at it as just a great opportunity. I pray that the church acts on it. I pray that we are led by the presence of God. His Holy Spirit leads us, give us the voice, the direction, the way, the wisdom, the knowledge, and understanding on what we should do. Even looking at it, my degree is in political science, so I have a BA in political science, a minor in criminal justice. And I'm going to have to say it. How many of those that's in the House, in the Senate, and the Congress, I'm pretty sure it's a pretty good percentage of them that goes to somebody's church.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Yep.
And you're going to let a party affiliation stop you from coming together as a people with your brothers and sisters to discuss whatever issues there may be.
Right.
Yeah.
So which one is more important?
Right. Right.
I look across the aisle. That's my brother. Regardless of your party, we've got to come together and make this country better.
Right.
Right.
So even those people that are in leadership positions should be setting the example as well.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right.
If you are a born again believer.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You know, and so it's even sad within that area. I mentioned earlier that I had to finally have the talk with our daughter, and how it came about, because I had spoke to the boys and told them, but I was watching the news, and one of the persons that was on there was being interviewed, and he said, I've got I think she was 16-year-old daughter, and he said, I had to tell her, African American, he said, I had to tell her, if the police gets behind you, if it's not in a well-lit area, you pick up the phone and you dial 911. And you drive until you go at a slow pace and let 911 know that you're on the phone and that the police is behind you until you get to an area that's well lit where you got some other people. I never thought I would have to tell her that. But I said, I was like, wow. I said, I need, and then right then I told her. I said, did you hear what she said? Yes, sir. I said, well, you need to do that. If police gets behind you, if it's not where some people around you, you call 911.
Yeah.
And you let them know what's going on, and you don't feel comfortable with pulling over on the side of the road. It's a dark road, and let them know that you're driving to a better area before you stop. And it just
wow.
Yeah. Breaks your heart.
Yeah.
That is heartbreaking. Let me, if you guys could allow me just one more question, and it's really for for Pastor Jackson and Taylor. How can Rich and I have your backs? I mean, literally, how can we, as a majority culture, have your backs in these days and days ahead?
I think that it's starting with what we're doing now, the dialogue, and then just standing by the side, support, letting us know that you see things now differently. You may not understand it in its totality.
Thank you.
I don't expect you to say, oh, okay, I got it. Let's run. No, I mean, when you look at it, it's, even though we are here now, even though we may work together, even though we may go to the same schools now, but there's still been a disconnect.
Yeah.
And so until you can, takes time to have these talks for you now to say, wow, I never saw it that way. I never knew that they had to go through it. And even some, now I'll be honest with you, I think, Richard, you mentioned some African Americans, the older ones, are going to have, because they went through it.
Right. Yeah.
They were called boy. They were called the N-word. They couldn't drink at the same, So it's going to take, it's not going to be the same for me to welcome in so quickly and so rapidly because of the hatred and what they went through.
Yeah.
But once again, those who can must grasp it at this moment and move forward with it, because it's going to take all of us collectively to come about to make the change.
Yeah.
And can you imagine, even within you said to help you and Richard, can you imagine now, just take it and multiply it to those that's on the police force that
right.
that have no knowledge or understanding of it.
Right.
And so that's the reason you've seen so many deaths that have taken place. Instead of a hood, they've got a badge on.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I can take the law into my hands and nothing. And when you look at the system, most of them have gotten off.
Yeah,
Right.
they have.
There's no recourse.
Yeah.
Right.
No.
So you're telling me the system is a just system?
Mm-hmm.
When I can take you and just say my life was threatened?
Mm-hmm.
Because if I'm not mistaken, I think all of those that beat Rodney King nearly to death, none of them served any time.
I don't think they did. Yeah.
And even with Trayvon Martin,
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
I've got skills, and you just a security person
Mm-hmm.
that's supposed to be just monitoring. 911 tells you don't need to follow him.
Right.
Yep.
Philando Castile.
Yeah.
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 Same thing. Yeah. Taylor, how can Rich and I have your back?
I think part of it is continuing to have this listening posture. I think that's important. I think we all agree that's why doing what we're doing right now is a big deal.
Mm-hmm.
And it needs to continue, right? This conversation, even if it's not the four of us, right? This kind of conversation needs to be happening a year from now, 5 years from now. It can't just continue to end.
Mm-hmm.
And I think not only is listening important, but I think also creating space for our voices.
Yes.
I know, having talked with others in the Asian American community, again, for some of the reasons we've discussed before, like culturally, we don't like to make waves.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard for us to speak up. It's been a personal journey for me to get to the place where I feel confident in speaking up. And part of the reason I feel confident in speaking up is I know that the senior pastor at our church, who's a white guy, supports me speaking up.
Yep.
And that helps me to speak and to be a
Yeah.
part of that conversation.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's easy. And again, for me, it's slightly different because I'm in a majority white space all the time by nature of where I live and by nature of the type of church that I work in. So, I think that's to me, that's really important is being willing to not only hear, but actually to seek out voices that are different than your own, to be challenged. And also, I think a lot of it too is giving charity to others, to practicing that neighborliness.
Right.
One of the things that I've been watching on Facebook is just how much that's not happening. There have been people willing to listen, but also I can count just many examples of people who are just simply unwilling to listen.
Yeah.
And again, people might have different beliefs, whether politically or otherwise, but at a base level, it comes back to some of what we were saying, recognizing that other person is made in the image of God, recognizing that God loves them and cares about them, seeing their worth as human beings, in particular in a church context, right? Like, I think, Charles, you said this, recognizing that person is your brother or sister in Christ.
Yeah.
And that, putting all of your differences aside, as great as they may be, the two of you have the most important thing in the world in common.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
And I think of Bonhoeffer, right? In Life Together, that's basically what he says is the basis of Christian community. And when you want to base Christian community around anything else, whether it's affinity towards a particular thing, you can throw all of that out the window if it's not based fundamentally on Christ.
Right.
And if you can't recognize that. And that's always a good check to me. And Bonhoeffer also has some really good words and wisdom about, also not pretending that your community is something that it isn't. Right.
Right.
To squarely see that, there are challenges in our community. And part of it, I think part of what the church can do and should do is say, how can we change the way we have these types of conversations with Christ, without the polarizing, without the bad mouthing, without the without just tossing an article on somebody's Facebook wall, not actually entering into dialogue with them, to hear them, to see their humanity, right? And I think that's what we need. We want to know that we are as human and as made in the image of God as anybody else. And there are times when we don't feel that way. And I know that there are times when my white brothers and sisters don't feel that way for a number of different reasons. It may not necessarily be skin color. It may be, your background growing up, or whatever else might be going on in your life. But I think the more we can affirm that in one another, the more we can come together.
Well, I just want to thank you all for your time. I know we're a little past what I had asked you to commit to, and I'm just deeply appreciative of that. And again, it doesn't have to end. We get an ongoing conversation, and for us as friends in this community, that gets to be a little bit more in person or in square boxes for now. But but at least I'm just so blown away by each of you and the generosity you've had toward me, being newer to the group with Path to Peace, but just the generosity you carry to your churches and to the church, all churches in Baldwin County have just been such a shining example. Thanks for helping me keep on understanding and keep learning. And so I'll just end it here, and you guys hold on. I'll cut the recording, but just thanks again for your time. I sure appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for pulling this all together.
Yeah.